Welcome to this panel on online disinformation and human rights. It's an honor to be here with two leading scholars and public activists, Professor Kate Starbird and Professor Sophia Nobel, to examine the role of digital disinformation and media manipulation in eroding public trust, entrenching societal inequalities, and driving polarization. I'm Sam Gregory, the Program Director of the Global Human Rights Network Witness. Let me start by sharing some contextual notes, and then we'll move into short introductions in our conversation. First, some definitions for those new to this space. We'll be talking here about disinformation and media manipulation. That's when people deliberately design, distribute, and spread false or misleading information for harm or profit. But I think our lines may well blur into issues of misinformation, the inadvertent or unintentional sharing of false information or inaccurate information without malicious intent. Next, I want to note the Nobel Prize Summit's hope to highlight what can be done in this coming decade to put the world on a path to a more sustainable, more prosperous future for all of humanity. Even as we delve into the harms of disinformation, online spaces, and technology, I'd encourage both viewers and panelists to also look what we can do to build that more sustainable, more prosperous future, and I would hope also more just, equitable, and inclusive future. This hope draws from the roots of this panel in human rights. This panel, as part of the Nobel Peace Prize Summit, or Nobel Prize Summit, is hosted by the Committee on Human Rights of the US National Academies, which works to raise awareness of issues at the intersection of science, technology, and human rights, and advocates for colleagues suffering rights abuses. So why human rights? As I hope we'll have an opportunity to highlight, human rights provides a globally recognized framework for understanding the competing claims at play when we talk about a phenomenon like online disinformation, and make decisions as governments, as businesses or individuals about what we do to counter it. Human rights offers us the language and the frameworks to understand the scope and limits of issues like freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and the right to seek or impart information. It provides ways to understand the right to privacy, the right to life, and how other rights, for example, to free participation in an election, can be hindered by discrimination and by issues with technology and disinformation. It highlights the potential discriminatory and disproportionate impacts of the actions states can take in response to disinformation. And importantly, it provides a framework for business as well within the UN principles, guiding principles on business and human rights. And here I'm looking at online social media platforms to act in a human rights framework. It also provides really specific tests of legality, legitimacy of aims, and proportionality and necessity for deciding when rights must be abridged. For example, when exercising your freedom of speech incites harm, or sharing misinformation leads to violence, or impacts others' rights to hear or access critical health information. In recent years, many UN experts on human rights, on racism, have addressed this topic. And most recently, Irene Khan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, is preparing a report on online disinformation and human rights. It's with these frameworks of human rights and disinformation in mind, let me turn to short introductions. First, myself, I'm Sam Gregory, as I mentioned, the Program Director of the Global Human Rights Group Witness. We help people use video and technology to protect and defend their rights globally, working with the millions of people who take out their smartphones to document injustice, and others who work with those people to secure accountability. I lead our work on emerging threats and opportunities, and have most recently led our global work on new forms of misinformation and disinformation, such as deepfakes. We've been a leading voice to ensure that people with lived and professional experience of existing forms of mis and disinformation globally set the terms about how we think about new forms of disinformation and the new technology infrastructures built to respond to crises of trust. We need to make sure they don't create further problems. I'll be moderating this conversation and occasionally chiming in with an insight from our own work. Now let me turn to my esteemed colleagues here. Let me first introduce Professor Sophia Nobel, widely known for her path-breaking work on online platforms, bias and discrimination, and her essential 2018 book, Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. She's an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, in the Department of Information Studies, and co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. We're also joined by Professor Kate Starbird, an acclaimed academic expert and researcher on misinformation and disinformation. an associate professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. She co-founded the Center for the Informed Public at University of Washington. Its mission is to collectively marshal the resources of a world-class research university to resist strategic misinformation, promote an informed society, and strengthen democratic discourse. I'm, of course, sharing only a fraction of their output and scholarship with these shorthand descriptions, so I encourage you to DuckDuckGo them, or if you must, Google them to find out more. As we go, I encourage you to ask questions in the chat. Let's launch now into conversation. I'll note that Professor Nobel has to step away 15 minutes before the end of the conversation for an unforeseen event, and that Professor Starbird and I will continue the conversation. So let me start by turning first to Kate. Tell us what brings you to this conversation. What are the patterns of online disinformation that you're observing now? And if you could talk about recent experiences and what you're seeing to help the audience understand what this phenomenon is, that would be tremendously helpful. Thanks, Kate.
Had to happen. All right, so let me give you a little context to start of just how I and my lab and my colleagues sort of got into this space, and then kind of talk a little bit about our more recent research and what we're seeing with trends in disinformation right now. Started out, I come from human-computer interaction, combination of sort of computer science and social science, and we started out looking more generally at the online behavior of people during crisis events. And around 2013, we started to study misinformation in the context of crisis events and look at sort of rumors and accidental misinformation that people were spreading during events like natural disasters and man-made events as well, such as acts of terrorism. Around 2015, we began to figure out that we weren't just seeing accidental misinformation, but we were also seeing patterns of pervasive disinformation where the same sets of actors were continuously spreading intentionally spreading false and misleading information for financial objectives or political objectives. And that became the sole focus of my lab and my work from late 2015 and until today. Certainly in 2016, in the United States context, we saw, and we talked about disinformation as these foreign attacks of inauthentic accounts that are spreading false information and pretending to be someone else. And certainly we documented that in 2016, and maybe the consequences of that, not the consequences, but the impact of that on the discourse about what happened in the 2016 election, talked about the targeting of specific populations and how we're all sort of vulnerable to mis and disinformation, as well as how it's asymmetric. And it seems to be spreading, it seems to be supporting the rise of right-wing populism in many places, including the United States, but other countries as well. Fast forward a little bit to 2020, or more recent research, we've been looking, we've studied several different events, but if we just focus in the US context on election 2020, what we saw was a very different story about disinformation. It was largely domestic. It was coming from within the country. It wasn't inauthentic accounts. There weren't fake trolls, pretending to be someone else. It was authentic accounts, blue check accounts, the accounts of elected officials, media outlets, and others that were consistently spreading content to both sort of shape this, what we're now calling the big lie, this idea that the election was going to be, fraudulent in some way, that it would be biased against Trump in some way, and President Trump in some way, and that and that there was this sort of massive voter fraud happening. So this was a false or misleading narrative, but there was a lot of effort to perpetuate that. And one of the things that we saw about disinformation in that context, it was we saw things coming from the top down, where President Trump himself would say the election is rigged, it's rigged against me. But we also saw it being participatory, where people actually went to the polls and misinterpreted what they were seeing in ways that sort of fit this voter fraud narrative. And they were actually, everyday people that weren't connected to people in power were feeling like they were part of this movement, and they were feeling like they were part of this effort to uncover voter fraud. And so we could see that the disinformation was coming from the top, and it was coming from the bottom as well. And the outcome of this is something that we've been thinking about for a while, is that pervasive disinformation of this kind sort of undermines democratic institutions. It undermines democracies because it undermines our trust in information, so we don't know where we can go for trusted information. It undermines our sort of common ground for coming together to make collective decisions. It undermines shared reality. We don't have to have the complete shared reality, but we all start to live in different realities where one group of people believes that they've been robbed of an election, and the other group, believes that there's no evidence of that. Then we have a hard time sort of navigating some of the problems that we face as a country. And so, and as a globe, right? So we have a lot of countries that seem to be facing some of these same dynamics. So we've been seeing disinformation as a threat to democracy, as something that's participatory, where everyday people don't necessarily know that they're part of these campaigns and that they're actually perpetuating false information that may not be aligned with their value systems, but that actually is supporting somebody else's political objectives. Even though folks can get caught up into these campaigns and thinking that they're part of these movements, we see them as actually disempowering because it's taking away their ability to actually make good decisions about what's happening in the world, because they're being manipulated into experiencing a false reality. And with that, I'll cede the floor, and we'll come back to other pieces of what we've been thinking about as well.
Thank you, Kate. Let me pass over to Professor Nobel. Sophia, could you talk about how you come to this conversation? And your research has been groundbreaking in highlighting the structural biases and harms of platforms like Google and the structural failings in our society and business models. How do you see platforms' roles in online disinformation?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity to join this panel. And I'm always in awe of Kate and her team's work, and of course, the important work of Witness. So just really grateful to participate here and illuminate, because it is true that the platforms are creating models, I think, for the kind of, well, let's say the facilitation and amplification of the kinds of things that Kate was just describing. So I can tell you that back in 2010, I first started looking more closely at Google and the kind of search results that it was surfacing that were profoundly misrepresentative of communities, particularly of kind of ethnic minoritized communities in the United States. Thinking about what's at stake back then, it's hard to believe a decade ago, what would be at stake for people who might be profoundly misrepresented in racist or sexist or both ways. Now, I was looking at that and thinking about that in terms of this kind of shift and transfer of trust by the public from other kinds of information and knowledge organizations, maybe that many of us might have grown up with, let's say a library or a public school, or trusted experts that we might know. And seeing that libraries were increasingly coming under pressure. They were kind of being defunded, not supported. People in corporate America and in the tech sector in particular were talking about, why do we need libraries when we've got search engines? You even started to hear some administrators and universities talking about Google search like it was this kind of giant liberatory library. And I was thinking, excuse me, nothing could be further from the truth, because search engines are advertising platforms. And I knew this, of course, from my own kind of 15-year career in advertising and marketing and watching the rise. I've been on the internet for a very long time, kind of watching the transition from virtual libraries and directories that were curated by subject matter experts and librarians and other kinds of people with deep knowledge, to these kind of gamified search engines that were really built on the logics of those who could pay the most in a 24/7 live kind of auction, which is what the AdWords kind of financial driver of search is. And those who had, let's say, a lot of technical skill would be able to game these systems to their benefit. And this would leave people who are particularly vulnerable in society, either without a lot of money or without a lot of technical skill or without a lot of numbers quite frankly, in the population to be subject to all kinds of misrepresentative notions, stereotyping and otherwise. And so, fast forward a decade and continuing to look, and now, of course, what we have is profound interoperability between Google's products, let's say search, and all kinds of other systems. We have many, many different kinds of information systems that use search as kind of a logic that's embedded into their websites. You have this kind of interrelationship between other organizations like Wikipedia. You have YouTube, which is a massive database of disinformation and propaganda that also flow across social media platforms. And so you have all of this kind of entanglement. And what happens is the most egregious, often the most egregious, titillating, racist, sexist types of disinformation and propaganda are the most profitable because they go viral. They are engaged with, using kind of the tech sector's words, engagement, right? They're clicked on. Racist and sexist and kind of disinformation oriented material is extremely titillating, which means it's extremely profitable. Even people who are not interested in it or want to look at it because they disagree with it, engage with it. So this kind of clickbait really facilitates what Kate is talking about, which is kind of the normalization of the flow of that kind of material. And I think one of the most harmful dimensions, as I watch tech company CEOs and leadership engage with Congress and regulators, is, they've really taken words, they've invented words like content to really disavow their responsibility for the flow of this kind of propaganda or disinformation. So words like content, and there's a new book coming out called Content, and the author escapes me right now, but people should be watching for this book. It really makes it difficult for the public to, let's say, determine what is propaganda and disinformation created by white nationalists or white supremacists, or neo-Nazis, and evidence-based research. I mean, a word like content really flattens all of that. Of course, there's a wide range of things in between that. The other thing I'll just mention is about the kind of role of these platforms in our society, and as they increasingly displace other ways of thinking and knowing, is that when you use something like a search engine, for example, and you look for, let's say in the United States, we're often likely to use it, let's say, to convert a measurement to metric, because Americans are terrible at that, or any kind of banal information. Search engines are going to be pretty reliable. And that reliability for the banal or the meaningless really reinforces trust, such that when people come into contact with disinformation, if it's coming up on the first page of a Google search result, they're very likely to believe that it's credible, that it's reliable. They think that there are people or algorithms that are vetting material that shows up to the first page, not understanding that any actor can optimize content. The highest bidder, in fact, can. And we saw this, a journalist reporting on this right after the 2016 presidential election. One of the most egregious cases was when you did a search on final election result for the presidential election, the first website on a Google search took you to a disinformation site that reported out that Donald Trump had won the popular vote. Now, we know that that is not true, that he won the Electoral College, but did not win the popular vote. And so we wonder then why the public is confused and, can be mobilized so quickly around a different understanding of fact versus fiction. And the platforms play a tremendous role because they're actually, in some ways, content agnostic. they're interested in who will pay them the most to optimize content and what will be engaged with the most. And I think that these things are incredible threats to democracy. They are harmful, and we are watching and witnessing kind of the amassing of more and more evidence of harm from these companies.
Thank you, Sophia. And I'm going to come back to the role of the platforms and what you'd like to see happen, because as you noted, regulation is on everyone's mind. There was a hearing yesterday in the US Congress on this and across jurisdictions. Kate, can I ask you a follow-up to what Sophia is describing and really ask you how you've seen this issue of the role the platforms play out in your work and your research? How does this manifest itself for the audience? How can they feel this very concretely in some of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard now. Everything is so interconnected. We have to think of this as an ecosystem of like all of these interconnected entities. And there's no part of that ecosystem, whether it's cable news or a newspaper, that's not affected by the fact that we have these online platforms. So the information moves across, platforms, and it moves across into these other things. So even if someone is just watching cable news, that's affected by the things that are happening in these online spaces. And these online spaces have a couple of different properties that are really shaping how information moves. And they're related to economic models and how they're all sort of optimized to get people's attention. But they also are related to how they're manipulatable. And this has been going on for a long time. And the results are what we're seeing now, but the manipulation has been happening for a long time. And it happens across a couple of dimensions. One are the algorithms that determine what we see on these platforms. So there's algorithms, we don't see everything that's posted. Certain things come to us and certain things don't, and certain things get promoted. And those who know how to manipulate the systems understand how to get their content to rise to the top so it gets more eyes on it. And so it's not just about, do we have the freedom of sharing content? Sure, we can all share content, but some content has a lot better chance of reaching people and is reaching millions or even billions of people, whereas other content doesn't reach anyone. So part of it is these algorithms that decide what we're going to see. They're also algorithms that decide what to recommend to us in terms of who to follow or who to look for, or whatever. And those following relationships become the networks. And the networks also kind of determine who we see, whose content is more likely to reach us because we're following them or they're following us. And so there's an interrelationship between these algorithms, the social network or the social graph underneath some of these platforms, and then our own behavior, because our own behavior trains the algorithms. We choose to follow people or not. And so we've got this structured system that has these three kind of interrelated parts. And the problem is that those who've been able to manipulate these systems have figured out how to get massive audiences for their content. The networks are now super densely connected. The disinformation networks that we were just detecting in 2015, we started to see these connections between the U.S. right, but then it became a very pro-Trump U.S. right, and then white supremacists, not just in the U.S. but in Europe, and then connecting to some far left groups in Europe around sort of what we now kind of recognize as this sort of WikiLeaks group where the right, the far left, and the far right meet. And then in the U.S. we've got these networks now of like QAnon conspiracy theorists and anti-vaccine folks. And initially we started to see that they were just kind of forming connections, but now after a year of COVID-19 and all of the kind of propaganda we've seen over and over again and mis and disinformation, these networks are very densely connected. They're redundant. You could take a bunch of folks out and the content is still going to spread because there's enough overlapping pieces of those networks to just pump this content out again and again and again. So I say these networks are now wired to spread disinformation, and without trimming a bunch of the connections that have, even if they change the algorithms now, the algorithms have already gone in, the recommendation things have already created these networks themselves, and so they're going to have to change the network structure and the algorithms in order to break this sort of characteristic where they're wired for disinformation. And I don't know that they're prepared to do that because they're still at the content level, and the content level is just not gonna work.
Kate, thank you. And I think you're touching also on the challenge that maybe we can come back to later for researchers of trying to understand everything on this beyond the content level, given the access we have to any information. And this has been a huge issue in the human rights community as well, as human rights videos blip out of existence and we never knew what took them down, under what circumstances or with any right of appeal. And so that sort of data challenge for us as external people feels really challenging when you're describing that incredible interconnectedness of understanding this and the implications over time of how the networks are structured. Sophia, can I come back to you? And you, as you were describing this, this challenge of the way that these platforms are structured and how they've built their systems. We're in a moment where people are looking for solutions. Do you see this as a place where there is a possibility to renovate these structures, or do you see the need for wholesale change? And I'm going to sort of plant a bug with us, because I'm seeing it in the questions as well, that we think about this both domestically in the US, but also the implications internationally, because this platform logic applies globally and disparately. But I would love to go to you to talk more about how you're seeing this and what you'd like to see.
Sure. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that, and I'm curious what Kate thinks of this, but I think that the wholesale design and deployment of the kinds of platforms we're talking about, that train has left the station, so to speak. I don't think you can reform these platforms. They are designed to optimize and maximize what they do. And it's also a cash cow for them. As I said, some of the worst kinds of propaganda are the most titillating and profitable. And so they don't have a economic interest whatsoever in harnessing or corralling these concerns. And I don't think that they are particularly sensitized to things like human and civil rights. I mean, they make their technologies with no attention, for the most part, to things like civil rights law or fair housing law, or all kinds of laws that are on the books, with the exception maybe of taking down content when it's illegal. And so this is where they have done better with respect to things like taking down child exploitation, child pornography. But it has really taken an incredible amount of pressure from civil rights organizations who have been able to put laws on the books, for example, to ensure that without those laws, these companies would not necessarily comply. I think about the way in which the profound networks of, let's say, sharing pornography in the Web 1.0 environment. In many ways, what Kate is saying is you have to have completely new models, which really gave a tremendous rise to some of the ways that Web 2.0 technologies work. People didn't want to be bombarded, for example, with pornography every time they got on the internet. And so they also were thinking about that. I've witnessed Google try on many occasions to suppress, downrank pornography, right? Because they know that is bad for business. It interferes with their legitimacy, and as kind of a different kind of institution in our society. So what that leaves then is the possibility for different kinds of models, different kinds of search, different kinds of social media. I argue in my book that what we need is not to have one monopoly leader in the space of search. But we could extend that to the scholars who are writing about the monopoly power of Facebook. I think we need many different kinds of knowledge resources so that we can disambiguate and differentiate. I mean, right now it's incredibly difficult to differentiate propaganda from, again, research or other types of informed journalism, because it all flows into one platform and or a handful of platforms in this case, and there is no differentiation. And I don't care if you put a little thin line down the front of the first page of web results to say this side is advertising and this side isn't, when what's there in the quote unquote organic search results is directly tied to what needs to be advertised. So, there's a lot of deception I would say, in the way that the platforms communicate what their products are. And so that leaves a huge opportunity for different kinds of alternatives to emerge. And of course, there's a huge, in the United States right now, there's a huge and growing public interest technology movement afoot. I'll say it's nascent, but there's this sensibility. I certainly think, for example, in the place of going to fact check something, wouldn't it be amazing to have people who are librarians or other kinds of teachers, professors, researchers, journalists, helping us make sense of and cull through knowledge and information versus computer engineers who are optimizing for clickbait? Those are extremely different models. What that would require, of course, is for in the US context, for us to not simultaneously kind of regulate big tech or think about regulating and also defunding universities, defunding public education, defunding libraries, because that is also what's happening. And of course, there's a relationship here between the way in which the tech sector, for example, the most well-capitalized industry on planet Earth, for the most part, engages in corporate tax evasion. They don't pay taxes for the most part. They offshore their profits. They don't reinvest back into the kind of knowledge infrastructures and other kinds of educational infrastructures that the country needs, except to look for market opportunities to sell their products and their services and their hardware and software. So that's not the model that we need. We need a model of strengthening public trust in public institutions that are more democratic, that are managed with expertise, that is not a profit imperative at all costs. And so I think those are the kinds of possibilities that are before us. And I feel hopeful that we will reach a tipping point quite soon, where we realize that we have to have alternatives rather than just trying to constantly think about reforming or begging CEOs of tech companies to do the right thing. It's an embarrassment that governments engage in such a practice of begging these companies to do better when they have the resources and capacity and, quite frankly, more of a moral authority to establish alternatives and to fund and resource those.
Thank you, Sophia. I want to pick up a few questions from the chat and kind of frame them for us so that we start. One of them, which has come up in a number of places, how do we think about online disinformation globally? And how do we think about the variance and the difference between democratic, quasi-democratic, authoritarian context? And this comes up a lot, obviously, in my work at Witness, and the questions of how do we think about this, and troubling patterns of also how disinformation is being claimed as an excuse for repressive laws globally. And I know there are many people in the research and scholarship community. I think of someone like Jonathan Korpus-Ong, who've been really saying, in the region where I work, Southeast Asia, for example, really it's the state I'm worried about and what they're going to do. And so I want to sort of put that out there and not downrank the platform, so to speak, but just ask us, as you look globally, how should we think about online disinformation? What are the variances? What are the different things we need to take into account? And maybe Kate, maybe Sophia, I can go to you first, and then to Kate.
Okay,
time-wise.
Sure. Well, Kate's research has really borne out the truth that authoritarian regimes around the world are taking hold of and weaponizing many of these different kinds of platforms and technologies to to the extent of facilitating human rights abuses, civil rights abuses. And we've seen these kinds of calls for ethnic cleansing and genocide in different countries around the world and in modern democracies. So we're going to have to, including in our own country, in the United States, where we've seen, the platforms weaponized for sedition and for, efforts to roll back civil and human rights in our context. So there's clearly no doubt that there's a profoundly uneven relationship between what states can do with these kinds of technologies versus what everyday people can do. And so there must be, I think, maybe different kinds of conversations about the proliferation of certain types of technologies. I mean, I put these on par with other types of dangerous weapons in society, like nuclear weapons and technologies that can wipe out or mobilize the wipeout of communities, because that is what's happening. When we look at WhatsApp and the way it's been used to galvanize people to commit murder and engage in incredible violence against minoritized people, we have to then think about these tensions. And there really is, I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to talk about public interest and government engagement with both the regulation of these technologies and the possibility for supporting new kinds of technologies, is because there are many governments that will abuse these technologies. And so, part of the question might be asked, to what degree some of these things should exist, because they change the nature of our lives, of our human, experience, in much the way that other kinds of technologies have radically altered the human experience. And this is where I think of things like fossil fuels, or again, nuclear weapons and other types of weapons. So I think, these are the very tough conversations that need to be had. In the United States, where our own government, I think, is oriented to thinking that it's in a AI arms race with countries like China. And so this makes it very difficult to, they are oriented and being oriented by some people in the space to think about the race to the bottom, quite frankly, right? Whoever the worst actors are in the world, whatever technologies they have, we have to have them too, and even better. And so that, of course, is creating more crisis.
Kate, can I go to you in terms of what you've been seeing and thinking about this question of variance? And I think, of course, we're seeing this in the context of COVID-19 as well as a global pandemic. So
there's so many elements here. I don't even know where to start. There's first off, when we think about disinformation and online, these are tools that anyone can use. They can be used to disrupt power disrupt the current power structure. They can be used to reaffirm a certain power structure. And we do see, like in democratic countries, we see more value of freedom of speech on these platforms, and so sort of proliferation of disinformation. In other more authoritarian regimes, we see the accusations of disinformation being used to shut down oppositional voices. And so there's definitely this tension between how how disinformation is sort of framed and what kinds of choices do we want to make. I remember being a researcher of misinformation a few years ago and looking at the China case, and China was in some of their platforms were giving social demerits to people who were caught spreading rumors. And I thought, oh, that's horrible. People, during a crisis event, people need to be able to share information, and sometimes they get it wrong. And so this idea that you would be shut down for spreading something that the government didn't like sounded really scary. And so when we first started talking about disinformation in the US context, people started saying, oh, we should be shutting down this content. I thought, well, this reminds me a little bit of what we were seeing. So there is this kind of tension when we're thinking about content-based and governments deciding what's okay on platforms. And when we look at it in one context, we may want disinformation to be regulated. We look at it into others, we can see how that can be a tool of oppressive regimes using that to silence freedom of speech. And unfortunately, some of the same tools that have allowed, oppressed people to come together and start a movement have also allowed, white supremacists to organize all over the world and share disinformation. And so there are these sort of tensions in terms of how we look at these tools. And certainly one of the things we see in disinformation globally is that there are networks, even though anyone can use it, there are networks of connections between different disinformation actors that continuously seem to share the same messages together. They don't always agree on everything, but they seem to be using these tools, whether it's the tools that are connected or the websites that launder their content are connected or something else, but certainly patterns in those connections where we're starting to see some real disruption in, I don't know how to say it, but we can see sort of like in the Syria context, the same folks that are spreading disinformation there are also spreading disinformation about the Uyghurs in China, and trying to deny that they're facing genocide, right? So when we see that denialism move across context, and it's something not just a shared ideology, but shared tools and shared networks of distribution of their content that seem to be powering some of this stuff, and that seems to be frightening as well. And I'm not sure yet. I have having studied this for a few years, there's still some blurry spots of like why these things come together, why do these things seem to align? And I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist myself to say that there's some big hand guiding it, but there's something about the systems themselves that have allowed these sort of networks of disinformation to develop, and they're global.
Sophia, I realize you may need to step away in a moment, so I wanted to give you an opportunity. Maybe shifting gears, I was going to ask you what needs to be fixed, but I actually wanted to ask if you see anything that's working right now. Do you see seeds of possibility right now that you'd like to see us building on in the online disinformation and human rights space?
Well, I think that we're having these conversations is incredibly important, and that the Nobel Prize community has surfaced this. I mean, there are a lot of people involved in these conversations now that a decade ago, there were a handful, and now I see thousands and thousands of people, journalists, activists, parents, scholars, all kinds of people who are raising an eyebrow and asking tougher questions and want more information. So that to me is incredibly important, because without that, it's difficult to kind of cohere new possibilities without people kind of really understanding what some of the problems are. So this work that we're doing of critique and surfacing problems really is an important step. And it's very different than, again, when people had a much more utopian view of the internet. I think we've finally left that behind. So that's that. I feel very hopeful about that. I will say, to me, one of the things that I've been tracking that I think is implicated in how these networks of disinformation get mobilized is that we have deepening global inequality. Now, when you have people who are experiencing deepening global social and political inequality, disenfranchisement, loss of quality of life, increasing kind of inhospitable climates where people are becoming refugees, where for no other reason than because of human-made conditions that have led to climate change. These broader structural issues are implicated in why people would gravitate to conspiracy theories and explanations. And of course, so many of us who are in ethnic communities, we understand the way in which narratives, stereotypes, propaganda, anti-Semitism, racism, these things get mobilized against us to explain things like economic crisis. So I think these are things we don't want to forget. We do not want to get so focused on just the technology and what the tech companies are doing that we divorce that from things like deepening global economic inequality, because people are less susceptible to those kinds of easy, nefarious explanations when they have access to education, when they have access to a high quality of life. So it isn't that the possibility for that also doesn't exist. It does. We have lots of resources in the world. We don't distribute those resources in equitable ways or in fair ways in countries all over the planet. So I think those are, to me, things that I would leave us on as a note, that we should be linking up these conversations about human rights to things like climate change, to things like economic inequality and precarity, to things like the defunding and devaluation of education and access to information and knowledge, because those things do coalesce in terms of, how a person can be devastated, quite frankly, by the conditions of their lives, and then be looking for ways to act upon that in ways that are harmful or otherwise. Sam, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Thank you, Sophia, for that really important reframe to the broader context, so we don't hive off online disinformation as something separate from society.
That's right.
I will let you go. I know you need to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
It's so great to see you both, and I appreciate being included. And I'll see you both soon.
Take care.
Bye, Sophia. Yeah, take care.
Kate, let me come to you, and I wanted to pick up on something that I know you've grappled with in your career, and I think it was sort of raised by Sophia in some of her comments there. As I think, and I grapple with it as someone who works with people who try and use the internet for good, right? Who take out their phones and they document, and I think we've often had this sort of perception of good actors and bad actors online. People, they spread disinformation or misinformation, or they're the virtuous witness. And I think your work over time has pointed to this really gray area of how do we understand who's these ecosystems of people who are doing digital activism or sharing mis and disinformation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do we disentangle this, or should we, or do we just need to understand that we live in a world where people use the internet for good and bad, and they may shift their roles day by day?
One of the things I've noticed in so much of the disinformation that we've studied, different kinds of cases, U.S. election context, in the context of Syria, in the context of some of the social justice efforts and the efforts against them in the United States, is that so many of the people that are spreading false and misleading information that are part of disinformation campaigns are sincere believers of that content. And we know that disinformation is always spread through witting actors and then unwitting actors as well. And now we have unwitting crowds who are motivated by political activism, motivated by some of these same conditions that Sophia was describing, these sort of inequities in society, a sense of grievance, in some cases, a sense of rightful grievance, in other cases, a grievance that's been sort of cultivated by those who want to use these audiences to spread disinformation and then kind of support their power. But it makes it a really hard question. It's always entangled, right? There's entanglements between these people that are motivated by what they think are good, are the right values, and they think what they're spreading is true. And if you look at what happened on January 6th in the United States and the sort of insurrection attempt at the Capitol building, so many of the folks involved described themselves as patriots. They thought they were on a mission from God or country, and that they were trying to stop a stolen election. And they truly believe that. You're talking about people who, many of them are putting their future freedom on the line, and indeed, many of them will go to jail. But they believe the content. And so, if you look back at the history of disinformation, Thomas Rid writes about this in his latest book, kind of having done some research on some early disinformation practitioners and some of the techniques. But the blending of what he calls active measures and activism has been going on since long before the internet, right? So active measures, disinformation campaigns have often leveraged organic political action, infiltrated it, and tried to shape it towards their own objectives. And we're seeing that now. We've got internet activism, which is something that I was studying, digital volunteerism during crisis events. And so looking at all the pro-social things that people do during disaster events. Now I'm seeing all these sort of what I look at as anti-social things people are doing to spread mis and disinformation, but it's the same people. It's that it's people that think they're helping, they're politically motivated. Now they've been cultivated by these campaigns, but they don't know that that's happening. And so it's really difficult to problematize the individual participants in some of these campaigns. We really have to look at the systems and then the folks that are purposefully cultivating these things to support and maintain their power.
Let me ask a question about individuals, because we focused a lot of attention on kind of governments and platforms, and I think a lot of people are asked the question, what information could I get that would help me be a better participant in the information ecosystem? What should I do? And I'm just picking from the chat, I see a question, asking about kind of signals. Could we require banners identifying the source of information or the truth of information? Is that a useful signal to a user? And this is something Witness has been involved in, looking at things like authenticity infrastructure to see how media gets tampered with. Or where do those types of signals fit? And what can individuals do in this space? How do we think about individuals in this and people rather than the sort of the infrastructure around them when they're trying to counter disinformation?
Yeah, one of the hard pieces right now is so many of us that are interacting in these spaces are already there's already a large number of people who don't trust the signals. They've been taught to not trust the mainstream media. You can't trust media. You can't trust the information. You can't trust big tech. You can't trust big media. And so a lot of times anyone who's doing the intervention to add the labels, the legitimacy of those labels is already questioned by the folks who those labels are most needed by. And so what we may see is that, and the work on labels in some of the social media environments is still kind of playing out, but it seems to be that it may work for a certain group of people that are in the middle. Some group already kind of knows that information, they shouldn't trust it anyways. There's a group for maybe people in the middle who haven't yet made their mind up about a particular topic for which a label may be helpful. But then there's a large group of people that are so already sort of distrusting of the labels and any entity that would be responsible for the labels in some of these environments, that the labels actually work as a marker for them that they should look deeper into the content, right? And so labels work for certain users in certain contexts. And in other ways, it's not necessarily a perfect solution. I don't think it's a bad solution to put labels on it. I just don't necessarily think it's going to work in these sort of polarized information environments where we have folks that are really deeply vulnerable to the conspiracy theories and already have this epistemology and trust networks that exclude the folks that would be creating the labels from anything that they would trust.
I'm noting a really rich set of questions in the chat, but we won't be able to come to all of them, and particularly also comments highlighting the disparities of how platforms behave in relation to power in the global south, in the majority world. And I want to just highlight that this is something we've heard consistently in our work, is not only do platforms ignore the experience of the majority of the world, but they also tolerate the abuses and the ways in which power corrupts systems globally. And so just want to name that coming from the chat as a comment and a couple of other questions that I think is really important when we're looking about this system that goes around disinformation. We're just coming to the end of our time, Kate, and I want to ask you, where do you think we'll be in 5 years? What's your where are we going to be in 5 years? And then my follow-up is going to be, how do we either promote that future or avert it? Just so you know, because I think I want to ask you both those questions really in sequence.
I try not to do much future casting. I really do think there are choices that we're all going to make, and the future's not yet decided. I have this sort of like human agency as primary view of the world. There are a couple of different potential futures. I think there's some hope of regulation for the current platforms that could make the situation better in some places. As Sophia points out, there are some just inherent toxicities and weaknesses of these platforms that I agree just aren't fixable. And because you can't start over, what they have now is so profoundly kind of broken that it's going to be difficult to see that being fixed. So I'm a little bit hopeful that some conditions will get better, but I think in 5 years, unfortunately, I do see a future where we're still kind of struggling with some of these same conditions. I don't see any like major movement that's going to disrupt what we have right now. I think the platforms that we have are not going away, and they're not going to get that much better. And it really will be a struggle for those that are fighting for democracy and human rights. I think we're going to still have to be struggling against the platforms. We're going to have to come up with ways of reaching the people we need to reach in order to help them if we can, help ourselves. I think I'm a little bit hopeful in some contexts that people are more aware of the dangers of disinformation, the role of the platforms, and that this may be making some of us more resilient. Unfortunately, I don't see that playing out in some of the communities that are most vulnerable right now in the U.S. I mean, talk to folks in them; they're just really resistant to messages that are helping them rethink what's going on in their information environment. So, I think we're going to still be teetering on the edge in 5 years, unfortunately, with in the U.S. a few thousand votes determining which direction we go, and we could still be going in a really, really ugly direction here. And clearly, the similar things are happening with sort of like Ong describes it so well Jonathan Ong describes it so well in their paper about the Philippines. This kind of interplay between the online information environments and those movements and these populist leaders they're kind of marching towards authoritarianism in a lot of different places. And I'm afraid that with our current conditions, we're still going to be facing these same struggles in 5 years.
Thank you, Kate. And I don't know if we've provided the hope in this panel, but I know we've provided a lot of, no, it's okay. I think false hope is the worst thing for any struggle, right? But we have indicated where we need to be working together. And it's one of the things I think that the human rights community is really coalescing around this. I think as an ally to movements worldwide that are fighting both disinformation, but these broader inequalities, that's where we need to start. And I want to thank you, Kate, and I want to thank Sophia for joining us earlier, and both the National Academies and the Nobel Prize Summit for hosting this discussion. And we're going to wrap up now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.